we've been talking about this for a couple months, I think, since we started to think more seriously about how to get the message of what it means to be a church that is perhaps on a more progressive side than some churches. That is certainly a group of people who want to think and wonder together and ask questions together about what does it mean to be a Christian in a global context where there are so many other faiths that some Christians feel like threaten their own faith, while I think many of us believe that plethora of other faith experiences actually enriches us. And when Charlene and I were talking a couple months ago, we thought, I wonder who could address some of these questions for us. And so the person who came to us in mind immediately was the Reverend Sonia Dunbar, who was the pastor here, the lead pastor, a spiritual pastor here at First Congregational Church in Claremont for most of 2024. And we had many, many interesting messages from her. And everybody is always happy to see you come back into the pulpit, and particularly happy for you to come and do these 4 sessions with us. So we are hoping that the electronic gods and goddesses are on our side tonight, and that those who are either viewing it tonight live or will look at the recording actually get the message and appreciate that. So no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sonia, and I'm going to hope to handle that side of it and cross our fingers and it'll all be smooth.
It will all be an adventure one way or another. Hi, everybody. Very good to be back, and probably won't surprise you that when Maggie and I first sat down to start talking about this, the original idea was about this big, and then it sort of became this big, and then this big, and then this big, and a little more variety. And so this is sort of one of those, if we're going to jump in, we might as well jump in with both feet. So tonight the topic is being Christian in a global context, and we're looking at the dangers of theocracy. So there's going to be a bunch of different definitions and examples throughout the course of this evening here. So what we're going to look at is patriotism, nationalism, and the realm of God. And sort of the underlying question I'm going to ask people to sort of hold lightly this evening is that dilemma of, in a sacred world, can we practice our faith without coming into conflict with the secular realm, and particularly the secular realm in terms of governmental structures. So the elephant in the room, of course, is the realm of politics. And for those of us who differentiate the role that politics should or should not play within the church, that always becomes a question, and always becomes a challenge for any of us who have been behind the pulpit on a regular basis. Guaranteed at least once in your career, you're going to be challenged on whether you are being too political. The thing is, faith formation and expression happens in the context of secular culture. So how and whether the faithful can openly express their beliefs is impacted directly by the cultural ethos and the impact of the governmental perspectives of the culture in which the faithful are living. What's this trying to do to me? There we go. So the first thing we're going to look at is patriotism, and a couple of definitions and some of the elements of it. Patriotism is simply having a strong sense of pride and loyalty toward your country. And it's expressed as a commitment to the ideals, the people, the culture, and the history of your country. And one of the key aspects of it is this willingness to make a personal sacrifice in some form for the greater good of the country. And frequently that comes through civic engagement or through military service. Now, patriotism, generally speaking, does not see diversity or inclusion as being weaknesses. Patriotism sees them as things that contribute to the vibrancy of the country and the culture. So patriots prioritize the common good over individual preferences.
There you go.
Sometimes it wants the up arrow, sometimes the down arrow, sometimes side to side. So Stephen Nathanson is the author of a book called Patriotism, Morality, and Peace. And he identified several primary aspects of patriotism. So that is special affection toward your country, defining yourself in some capacity through the lens of your country, saying, I am an American. Having an interest in and a willingness to sacrifice in some way for the welfare of the country. Now, by that doesn't necessarily mean the intense sacrifice of military service. That can be sacrificing your time to serve on the local school board. That can be volunteering your time to serve as a greeter at the local hospital. But it's that idea that you are giving some aspect of yourself over to help develop and improve the circumstances for the country in which you are living. Patriots believe their country's government, core values, and people are essentially good, and that everyone should work together for the country's benefit. So patriots in many ways view their country as a large community of cooperating neighbors bringing different strengths to the table for the benefit of all. The teachings of Jesus and patriotism are not incompatible. I'm going to stop there for a second. Any questions or anything that bubbles up on the idea of patriotism?
Would that include Would that include paying taxes? Because you're giving up of something for the benefit of others.
Yes, it can. Yes, absolutely. That is one example of following speed limits. Could also be an example. So something that is a tangible giving of yourself. I mean, everyone here has been in a service where we refer to an offering as a giving of our time, talent, or treasure. And that concept of offering comes into patriotism as well. And so something like taxes, yes, could be an example of that.
Could I ask a question? You may have said this at the beginning, but the definitions that you're talking about, are they your definitions or are they from writings, or where did they come from?
These were, this is sort of a rewording of various definitions through government websites, books, websites, etc.
Okay.
One segment of it is from the author Stephen Nathanson. In his book, Patriotism, Morality, and Peace.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yes, Anita.
I don't want to be a Debbie Downer by any sense of the word, but unfortunately, in my own personal feeling is patriotism has gotten a bad rap, so to speak, because there's a group of people who've adopted their great patriotism who definitely are not serving what I think we think of as the definition of good patriots.
And you've just set me up for section number 2. Good job, dear.
She said, she probably arranged that ahead of time.
I know nothing about it. Patriotism versus nationalism. The core distinction between those two is that nationalism incorporates beliefs about the superiority of your country. So there is this idea that there is one correct expression of national identity, and any other expression is in some way invalid. It also looks at, it also takes that idea of superiority to the point where the country, through its government and through its entities, feels that it is entitled to express that sense of superiority over other countries. So it's both an internal and an external aspect to it. Nationalism, and this is part of what Anita was sort of implying here. Nationalism violates the second great commandment of Jesus to love your neighbor. Superiority in nationalism has a secular motivation. Looking at national identity in the context of a nationalistic governmental structure. Nationalism advocates for a single form of identity. It's attempting to establish one single expression of culture, requires a single common language, and a solitary ethnic identity. And it defines what each of those are. Prioritizes the interest of the dominant national group. So that concept of dominant national group underlies everything that happens in a nationalistic government. And those interests of the dominant group always take precedence over individuals or over other groups. So where patriotism sees diversity as distinction, nationalism utilizes it for purposes of division and as a justification for oppression. That idea of the dominant underlying national expression requires support, preservation, promotion. It becomes the government's job to do that. So in a nationalist system, the government exists to protect and promote those interests of that dominant group. The dominant group need not be a majority group. In order to achieve those ends of protection and promotion, the government has to be given the power to assert that dominant culture and suppress any aspects that come into opposition with it. In extreme instances, nationalistic government uses its authority to take federal level actions against any opposing domestic group and against the influences of other cultures.
No, no, no. Let's hijack the word.
Nationalist governments promote the policies and goals. Promote policies and goals that are intended to shape or influence particular social and or political structures, always for the benefit of the dominant group. In doing that, they allege that preservation of a national identity is necessary. And it is necessary to explain and justify actions to preserve those political, economic, or cultural aspects that are important to the dominant group. Now, if and when the dominant culture changes, the government should be changing along with it. When that doesn't happen, the stage is set for authoritarianism, which is, in my informal definition, authoritarianism is government despite the people. Nationalism, a nationalistic government, not only affects what happens within the bounds and boundaries of the country, but it affects how that country is perceived and operates on the global stage. And that happens in three different areas. The ideology. A nationalistic government's system of ideas, beliefs, and values form its understanding of the world and how they respond to global events. If you believe your country is superior, you bring a particular dynamic into every relationship that you have. Whether that's with other people, with other branches of your government, with organizations, with global partners, and brings a level of, let's say, friction to all global relationships in some way. In terms of cooperation, because they have to justify the perceived superiority, that leads to a lack of cooperation in global matters. You could have examples where, well, yes, as a group, we agree that X should be taking place, but we shouldn't have to do that because of Y. Or we already did this part and therefore we don't need to do this part. You need to catch up with us. So that's the dynamic under cooperation. Now, surprise, surprise, that can lead to hostility. So in extreme instances, rampant nationalism can result in open hostility toward other countries and can rise to the level of direct conflict with other nations. Nationalist governments ultimately, ironically, become weaker globally as other countries begin to coalesce in reaction to the presentation of the belief in superiority. So any questions or comments now on this idea of nationalism and how it differs from patriotism?
I just was thinking as you were talking that there's some, I might not put my words together right, but there's some paradox at work here in nationalism, that nationalism appears to need the other that they need to go against. And so what if there were a world, God help us, in which Christian nationalism took over the United States and then it took over everything else in the world, and the whole world became Christian nationalists under one flag, whatever. It's like Christian nationalism could no longer exist because now it does not have the thing to be the other. It's a weird thing going on in my brain, but
Right.
it,
No,
it,
you're-
it, you know, it's, in short, it requires an enemy. It requires maybe not an enemy, but the other to define itself. Because
right.
if there's not another,
You can't be superior if there isn't something that you consider inferior,
right,
whatever
Right.
that may be.
and if you think of a world, a better world, in which the kingdom of God, as we talk, prevails, then there can be no Christian nationalism because everybody is
Right.
equal.
What happens then? Oops.
Speak, I think this is
Yeah.
probably picking up everybody, so just speak from where you are,
I
but
was
speak
just
up.
thinking, isn't that the definition of communism?
That everybody is equal?
No,
No?
No.
no. Well, communism requires the government to take over everyone, to
Hmm.
take over the business and take over property and that sort of thing.
That's what they're
So
doing.
this isn't what that, this is not the same?
Right, because the difference would be that the equality in, one way to think of it is the equality in communism comes from the superiority, not of the country, but the superiority of government.
Right.
Equality is that everybody now becomes equally inferior to the governmental structure. So there's some aspects that dance on the edge of it, but don't actually tip over into it. You can have a nationalistic government with fully private enterprise and businesses. And that would not be an aspect of a communist government.
So what, in your opinion, sets the stage for a rise in nationalism? I have my opinion based on different parts of history, different places in the world. But what, in your opinion, sets the stage?
Specifically nationalism or specifically Christian nationalism?
Nationalism.
I think in my understanding is that one aspect that whether it is a dominant aspect often becomes sort of a common theme under a lot of nationalistic governments is there has been some external infliction of a belief of inferiority. The primary example of that would be the rise of Hitler's Germany.
But don't you think that the door that was open for that to happen was runaway inflation? I mean, they had been, because of the way World War I ended, you know, they were in a
Correct.
position of probably feeling like they had to defend themselves.
Correct.
But then the economy just
Right.
went into overdrive, and so my opinion is when I study history, usually what happens is there is a need, whether it's economics
Mhm.
or a position in the world where people feel like they really have to defend themselves. It opens the door for someone to come through that door and give the people inspiration.
Correct.
Not necessarily in a good way, but to bring pride back to the country,
Correct.
to promise something in government that's going to make my life better. Because things are just unraveling economically, it's not working.
Right.
And it can be, and it's always funny to me because I used to study the Soviet Union when it existed. But when it fell, and in 1991, they tried free market economy. Problem was, they didn't know how to do it.
Right.
And so it wasn't that long thereafter where they're holding placards of Stalin, of all people, saying life was better with Stalin. And if you know that history, it boggles the mind.
Right.
But I think what makes nationalism so scary is because it somehow taps in to people's need, whether it, and it promises something,
Mhm.
and people get behind it without understanding what's really gonna start happening.
Right, right. Nationalism, now it may be economically triggered.
Mhm.
And that economic trigger could have been triggered by something else.
Mhm.
Somewhere in that chain, an event, a collapse of an economy, a response to a collapse in an economy. Somewhere along that chain, you will find a national sense of being undermined and deemed, whether actually deemed so or not, deemed inferior, possibly inferior to the good old days,
Mhm.
which we all know never truly exist. But economics, often there is an economic aspect to it, but somewhere within that chain, in that definitive expression, that obvious expression of a collapse of an economy, or a plunge, if not a full collapse of an economy, there is the psychological sense of having to respond to being inferior.
Is that kind of what led to, I think, a lot of people, if you talk to them, the reason they voted us way one way or another in any of the last couple of elections is anger. But that anger, I think, actually is a part of fear. I mean, if you're fearful of your means and your whatever, you're gonna get mad. And I think particularly with people who haven't experienced as much of life as maybe other people have, they just think it's all against them and they're mad.
Right. I think you'll, sometimes those, what we think of as being an individual emotion can happen on a community level, on a regional level, and on a national level. So anger as an expression of fear is a very individualistic human expression, but that can absolutely happen on national levels. And in segments of that. And so that sort of leads to that idea where I was talking about, there are times when the, who constitutes the dominant group will shift.
Yeah, what I started thinking of was being in seminary in the 1980s, and there was a critique of the white male system,
Yes,
a critique of patriarchy. There was a lot of feminism going on. And then when I was ordained in 1990, that was, you know, women were kind of like starting to really be more accepted, and I thought, yay, this is great. And now the pendulum seems to be swinging back, and having more conversations about, you know, complementarianism and trad wives and all this weird stuff. So it's like the dominant group, when they feel threatened enough, that they'll, you know, make another move, because like women going to school and succeeding
right,
should not on its face be a threat to anybody. But if you're a mediocre man used to having a job without fighting for it, and you see women succeeding, it could make you mad. Especially if she gets a job and makes more money than you do. Yeah, like,
right,
We can't let that happen.
right. Or if you are unemployed, and even if it is a job you do not want, would never do, and have no interest in whatsoever, you can react to the employment of someone who is of a different gender or a different ethnicity. Solely on the basis of, and again, that sort of touches on that idea of the economic collapse. On a personal level, it's an economic collapse. And so you respond with fear, psychologically with fear.
I'm thinking back several hundred years, thousand, a couple. And the world into which Jesus was presumably born was a topsy-turvy world of economic, disparity, huge economic disparity. And that voice attempted to be a voice pointing us to love our neighbors, to peace, to working things out in a culture in which others were saying the Messiah would be that militaristic, nationalistic personality that would save them. Obviously didn't work out so well for Jesus in some ways. And yet, 2000 years later, we continue to try to bring that voice back and say, this happened 2000 years ago. And we want this voice of love and hope and connection to be strong again. But going back hundreds of years again, that Jesus thing started a movement that was pretty powerful. It was powerful enough that we still hang on to it today, in spite of all the ups and downs. It's pretty powerful. And then all of a sudden got more powerful around about 300 when our dear friend, the Holy Roman Emperor, came to exist. And the Holy Roman Empire came to exist, which ultimately also crashed. And I guess I'm saying this thinking, are we destined to this sort of up and down, the rise of people who bring the hope and the love, and that lasts for anywhere from decades to hundreds of years, and then the crash into whether it's the dark ages or what some of us feel we're living in now or might be soon living in here in our own country. That's more just my brain thinking aloud, but we've been here, done this, and we keep on doing it.
Right. And so the irony in that for people of faith is when you are living in those times of empire and constriction, maybe even direct oppression and violence,
Occupation.
Our history shows that at a minimum, cycles turn, change comes. And that voice of love your neighbor fuels the dominant group and shifts the dominant group. So thinking of sort of so there's ironically a sense of hope in it. And so part of what we as people of faith need to hold on to, as difficult as it is, as tenuous as it feels at times, is that we follow an inspirational model who has always fed our hope that things will be better, that things will change. I don't know that we'll ever, I don't know that we will ever stop a cycle such as that fully. I think we have the capacity to evolve so that those times of the dominant group being centered on love, those times can last longer. Those times can be stronger.
Well, don't you think the Christian nationalists today feel like they are the voice of love? They're saying, you know, Charlie Kirk and all, love each other. We're bringing back the great society where men are dominant in the home and the women are at home loving their children and all. I mean, you hear that language so that they think they're the loving group, where the rest of us don't hear it as a loving approach. It's a dominant authoritarian approach. But don't you think the dominant group in charge thinks they're right in that way?
I think they are expressing it that way. I don't believe they are being authentic to themselves in expressing that.
Okay.
They're
Yeah.
utilizing those words because they know and feel sufficiently that what they are suggesting is not about love, it is about power, and it is about exclusion.
Right.
And so they, within their very narrow definitions and their very narrow parameters, I believe there certainly are some who do believe that they are expressing love. Which then triggers that cycle again for those who say, those who can look at their definition and their parameters and their parameters of expressing love and say, but wait, that's not what these 17 texts say to your one text, your one scripture passage that you are screaming violates these 17 quiet passages.
Mm-hmm.
So we will actually touch on Christian nationalism in just a moment here, and we can have a little more dialogue on that then, but I believe that's absolutely true.
I just want to do a sound check. Karen and Nancy, when other people in the room are asking questions, can you hear them?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right,
I just
Susan,
want to make a quick comment about cooperation,
yes,
because it explains to me why there is such hostility from our president, number 45,
yes,
originally against the UN. You know, like,
right,
I couldn't figure that out. Like, why are you making such a big stink about the UN ripping us off and that sort of thing? But it's, you know, to justify their perceived superiority, that makes a lot of sense. Like, we don't need you people.
Mm-hmm.
right, right. And so you come in on an individual level, tying into, was it Nancy who made the comment
Yeah.
online, that sort of ties in with this idea of cooperation. If you have to justify your perceived superiority, and the people that you are attempting to express superiority over are people who talk about love, I mean, you're automatically coming into an emotional psychological conflict right there. Because you're trying to express power over love as opposed to power with.
Yeah. Right.
So let's move us along here. So we have concept here. So theocracy, that's not necessarily a common household word here, so. Definitions in the first bullet point here. A theocracy is a form of government where the religious leaders are the actual or de facto heads of state. The actual head of state does not need to be a religious leader. There can be a governing body of religious leaders who determine the parameters within which that head of state must operate. Theocratic government's authority is believed to have been ordained by a deity. Religious texts and doctrines are the foundation for both the governance and for determining social norms. Theocratic laws are based on religious principles. Theocracies can work, but they work where everyone, in situations where everyone agrees that a particular religion's tenets apply to that country's sense of identity. And when everyone agrees on what those tenets are and how they should be expressed. So they can work if there is a situation where there is an absolute agreement that this country, this entity is governed and bound by religious tenets, and we all agree on what those tenets are. Examples of theocratic states are Vatican City, which is an independent theocratic entity where the Pope is the official head of state. Iran is a theocratic state where Islamic law, known as Sharia, is the basis for the government's legal system. And other theocratic states are Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Yemen, and Mauritania. Certainly could be others. Vatican City is an example of a theocracy that works. Iran is not. That's kind of a statement of the obvious. Iran is not. But Sunnis and Shiites can interpret Sharia law differently. So all the same overarching faith tradition, Islam, but two different expressions of it, and different in many ways.
That goes back to the whole thing we were just talking about, the Charlie Kirk's, one version of love, another version of love, all under the banner of Christianity.
Right. Yeah, there comes a point where I can tell you that I'm 6'2". But we kind of all know I'm not. And so there's sort of that, joking aside, there's that aspect to it. Absolutely. So some nations that are not theocracies that we may think they fall in this category are Israel and India. Even though there is significant religious influence in both of those countries, they technically guarantee religious freedom. Number one, and number two, the governmental powers aren't held in, within the power of religious authorities. Neither Modi nor Netanyahu are religious leaders. And there is not an explicit governing body of Hindus or Jews which is dictating to them how they should lead the country. It is their personal sense of faith that is guiding their decisions. Now, if we look at this strict definition of what a theocracy is, strictly speaking, at this time, the United States is not a theocracy. Our head of government is not a religious leader.
Well, that depends on who you ask.
And I repeat, and there is no official governing body that is dictating the parameters under which governance of the country takes place. So questions on theocracy right now before we move on. So the question we're all,
So I'm sorry,
Go
what
ahead.
came to mind was Puritanism in this country in
Yeah.
the 1600s in Massachusetts or wherever else. It was a disaster. It
right,
was tried, it failed.
right.
And we're all descendants of it.
Which was why this group had ended up in Pennsylvania, and this group ended up in Minnesota, and this group was in Rhode Island, and yeah. Yeah. But now we come to the fun question. What about Christian nationalism? This past year, the Vermont conference, one of the keynote speakers at the Vermont conference was Reverend Carter Hayward, who wrote this wonderful book right after January 6th called The 7 Deadly Sins of White Christian Nationalism, a call to action. And if I could give copies to every single church I was associated with to read, I would do so. I highly recommend that churches, whether it's a small group within the church or church leadership, that they take the time to really delve into this book. I'm going to do a quick survey of her work here tonight. So the information is on the slide here, so you can go back on the recording to take a look at it. So the 7 deadly sins inherent in white Christian nationalism that Hayward identified. I'm going to wait a second for people to take the photos of the screen if you're here in the room. You folks get that?
We'll also
Okay.
make this recording available to everybody,
Okay.
assuming that the electronic goddess worked.
It's hard to see the screen, Maggie. Will you send out
Yeah,
anything of the slides?
sure.
Yeah, I'll share the actual slides with Maggie.
Okay, great.
So the 7 deadly sins inherent in white Christian nationalism that Hayward identified are the lust for omnipotence, a sense of entitlement, white supremacy, misogyny, capitalist spirituality,
Would that be as in abundant, what is the other term for that? Abundant?
Blessing.
Say it again.
The
Prosperity gospel. Oops.
Yeah, yeah.
Gospel, is that the same thing?
Prosperity gospel.
Is that prosperity gospel?
That is one aspect of it.
Okay.
Domination of the earth and its creatures and violence.
Mm.
So we're going to look at these each one by one. And then Reverend Hayward offered some steps, which he calls calls to action, that people can take a look at. So our first two deadly sins, the lust for omnipotence. It's grounded in a belief in an authoritarian, oppressive deity who exercises power over humanity. It includes an assumption that since we are created in God's image, we are divinely called and authorized to also exert power over others.
Mm.
So the lust for omnipotence isn't based on how we define or respond to our neighbor. It's based in how we view God and God's relationship with humanity. So the second deadly sin, sense of entitlement. So this arises out of an assumption that we have and are owed a place of privilege and are entitled to the best and the most. Now that sense of entitlement trickles down to the belief that the US governing documents were written by white Christian men. Therefore, white Christian men should continue to dictate the terms and parameters of government. Now, that also means that the only brand of Christianity that is true, and this gets to what Nancy was implying, is the one that affirms that entitlement. White supremacy is deadly sin number 3. So that involves the assumption that everyone who is perceived as white is entitled to greater benefits from society. Now, from the churches, that perspective has been exacerbated for centuries by us depicting Jesus as a white male.
Mm.
And in equating non-racism with anti-racism. Blackness or non-whiteness of any form is considered inferior. So African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinx, and indigenous peoples all fall under that umbrella. So blackness becomes a metaphor for inferiority of being. Misogyny is also sort of a similar case here. Heterosexual cisgendered men claiming entitlement to exercise power over women, non-heterosexual males, or non-cisgendered persons are examples of misogyny. This has grown and expanded from when many of us were in our particular wave of the women's rights movement, where misogyny strictly referred to men's attempt to exercise power over women. So this is now expanded to include those other groups of Americans. It continues to be expressed through oppression and violence. And what it says is that this new expanded, the difference between misogyny and white supremacy, they're intimately related. But misogyny says that even if you are white, if you are not a cisgendered hetero male, you are inferior. Deadly sin number 5, capitalist spirituality. That's an expression of lack of love for neighbor. And that is any form of systemic economic injustice. So obvious ones that we see are food insecurity, restrictions on healthcare, who can have it and what type of healthcare they can have. Unaffordable housing, denial of essential human well-being to particular groups of people. Capitalist spirituality prioritizes the economic well-being of the dominant culture at the literal expense of every other group. Deadly sin number 6, domination of earth and its creatures. This is based in the belief that creation exists for humanity's benefit and that humanity was divinely granted power over it. It's expressed as rampant consumerism and viewing the earth and non-humans as commodities, among others. Creation domination can have an economic injustice aspect to it. It often involves aspects of denial of severity or existence. So climate change deniers use their claim to justify continued resource exploitation. And that is one aspect of deadly sin number 6. And then the final one is prevalent in some manner throughout all of the others, and that is violence. And that can be open, active violence and oppression, restriction, but it can also be scapegoating. Often starts with this aspect of scapegoating. Scapegoating people of other nations and cultures, religious traditions, gender and sexual expressions. And that scapegoating depicts them as being alien, unpatriotic, and or dangerous to the white Christian American hetero male. I'm not all I'll wait for a potential flood here. Questions and comments on the 7 deadly sins of white Christian nationalism? Susan?
So going back to number 5, capitalist spirituality, I think that one of the comments of one of the people on cabinet of the current administration was that they wanted to traumatize federal employees and make it so that they didn't want to come to work. And then my union contract was ripped up unceremoniously. And now I'm actually working, getting paid, so I don't really have anything to complain about, but there's federal employees who are working, who are not getting paid. And now they're threatening to cut SNAP benefits as of this weekend. And so I just saw this up until recently as just abject cruelty and meanness. But when I look at that capitalist spirituality and I think about the larger picture of, you know, this economic system that we're suffering from right now, this is not new. It's on steroids, but you know, you had inadequate housing and all these other things years ago. But the realization that this is on purpose, that this is part of the freaking plan.
Right.
Like there's some sinister plot at work here. Are you gonna get to that or like?
It calls for action.
Okay,
But
it's
so feel free to supplement.
It's very eye-opening to, you know, and it hurts to realize that the plan is to have housing be unaffordable. And to
Right.
have restrictions on healthcare and to have people die. Right. And to be sick. And not to reach their potential. I mean, it's heartbreaking.
Sonia, this is Karen.
Hi, Karen.
Can people hear me?
Oh, yes.
So this Carter's book, I'm sure, is really helpful in terms of a structured way to have the conversation. But really, finally, for me, Christian nationalism is just apostasy. I mean, you cannot read our holy book and forget that the greatest commandment is to love God, body, mind, and soul. And it seems so self-evident that any one of these 7 sins puts something, someone, some system, some belief, something above God. And so I don't know that there even needs to be a conversation because this just makes me all so crazy.
But you're not really Christian.
Yeah.
It's co-opting religion for power.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And that is one of the reasons why when you, I loved your comment because one of the things that struck me, Susan, when you were talking about the situation with the federal workers, if you want a real world example of the difference between a patriot and a nationalist, the patriots are the federal workers who are working despite not being paid by the nationalists.
Yeah.
What I wanna know is why is the president still being paid and why is Congress still being paid? They're government workers and they're not working.
Is that in your call to action? What do we do about that?
One is based on being the Northern Vermont farmer's daughter, which is one whole realm of call to action, and then there's the educated minister who has a different approach, theoretically. But the calls to action, when we get to them, I want to entertain if there are other comments here on this, on the deadly sins themselves or this concept of the deadly sin. But the calls to action are the ways that you undermine the insistence of how the dominant group operates. And we'll get to some specific examples. You undermine and you educate and you find the ways to refuse to play the game. And now Carter, bless her heart, didn't word it that way in the book, but that was essentially what she said when she was speaking with us at the Vermont Conference annual meeting. That churches in particular, in the presence of Christian nationalism, are in the position to educate, communicate, and lead the way in not playing the game. So any other questions about the deadly sins themselves? As we all agree with what Karen said.
And I want to emphasize again how Petra hit it right on the head, that
Yes,
religion has been co-opted for power. And that goes back to what I was saying about the early church, the early Christians, and then Constantine and the Holy Roman Empire. Every single time is co-opting religion in the interest of power.
one of the names, one of the titles utilized for the Caesars was Prince of Peace.
Hmm.
And that title was used because they so subjugated the people that they conquered that the people felt unable to rise up against them. So peace was not a sense of prosperity and well-being. Peace was equated with defeat so extreme you could not respond.
Quelling is the word that comes to my mind.
Yeah.
Could you say that one more time? I didn't quite get all that. Would you just repeat what you just said?
That Caesars, the Roman Caesars, were referred to as a prince of peace because there was a lack of war.
Okay.
But that lack of war came about from the utter crushing of the people that they conquered, to the point where they felt unable in that moment to rise up against the oppression of the Caesars and the empire.
Okay.
And into that mix came the other person that people called the Prince of Peace.
And into that mix came an ordinary man preaching love,
Mhm.
preaching peace, preaching hope, riding on a donkey.
Mhm.
You know, that reminds me a little bit of just briefly here in Texas, the education system is really a systemic setup to quash people who are people of color, who are often the main people who are in the public school system. But because they're being poorly educated, many of them, they are going to have less power to rise up and fight against the system. But the idea of white people in the system helping them rise up, that feels a little awkward, you know. We're coming in to help you rise up rather than you rise up on your own and claim your own power. It's just here in Texas, education is a big issue right now, and they're trying. I believe the governor is trying to set it up so that the public education system fails.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's happening here.
Yeah. that's
Mhm.
happening here.
In Vermont too, that's a similar
And-
situation.
But New Hampshire, we're
New
much,
Hampshire, yeah, okay.
Vermont's perfect. We have no problems over there.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I think we're way ahead of you here on that problem.
Because there are no children anymore.
Yeah,
Ah. So that makes sense to me, what you're saying about squashing Prince of Peace. I get what you're saying now.
It's a good, Nancy, it's a good contemporary example.
Yeah.
excellent example.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm mindful of time, so I'll kind of run the way through these action slides, and we can have a little more dialogue after this. So the response to a lust for omnipotence is taking actions of empowering one another. If we are made in the image of God, then we have to recognize that God cannot be both all powerful and all loving unless we reconsider and redefine what it means to be powerful. Because God's character is deeply relational, our call is to express power with, not power over, others. In the Revised Common Lectionary, we have just been exploring the prophetic voices during times of exile. And consistently, the prophets equate exile with failure to love God or neighbor, and return from exile with bringing people back into alignment with God's all-inclusive justice and love. So if white Christian nationalism represents our exile, the question we need to be asking ourselves is what would initiate our return? And sort of getting into some of the comments that were just made, that social justice phrase, nothing about us without us, can be a guide. So now the question to ask ourselves is, are we actually in dialogue with those we want to lift up? And have we asked them what would be most supporting for them? Call to action number 2. Embodying humility is a counter to this sense of entitlement. We need to become grounded in humility as a counter response to expressions of entitlement. And that's going to involve recognizing that humility is not about being modest rather than being arrogant. It's not thinking about ourselves as better than or lesser in value than our neighbors. And humility is a difficult concept to sort of grasp and sit with, because traditional church teachings say that the less we are noticed, the closer we are to God.
Hmm.
We need to stop accepting that. We need to emulate Jesus, who engaged people in direct, honest, and forthright ways. Whenever the Pharisees challenged Jesus, the Pharisees, the elite biblical literalists, challenged Jesus, he always responded to them. He always went into dialogue with them. We also need to remember that Jesus taught his disciples, you don't need to be perfect. When he sent them out into the world, he essentially told them, do your best. Let go if you fail, and keep moving. And here the important thing to remember is that not to act is to act. Not to speak is to speak. Not to speak out is to act. Silence represents acceptance of the status quo. Counter to white supremacy, call to action number 3, is approaching the blackness of God. And by blackness, it was what I mentioned earlier. Any non-whiteness so we need to educate others that color is a social designation that communicates proximity to or distance from power. If you can be labeled Black, colored, BIPOC, Indigenous, Asian, to any extent, you automatically are lower in the social systems and standing and are deemed incapable of exercising power. Challenge the assumption that whiteness entitles a person to special privileges and opportunities. In churches, we need to start educating ourselves about microaggressions. And we need to recognize where we, as at least majority Caucasian people, have privilege on the basis of race. Men need to recognize where they have privilege on the basis of gender. Heterosexuals need to recognize where they have privilege on the basis of sexual expression. We can start moving in the right direction by learning about and sharing the history, the arts, and the stories of non-white peoples, and bringing those into our churches and our communities. Honor those stories. We also need to challenge any theological image of God and Jesus as white males. We need to explore expressions of Christianity and of spirituality of various non-dominant cultures. Look at what Christianity looks like in India, in the Caribbean, in Africa. Call to action number 4. The response to misogyny is empowering women, celebrating sexuality, and affirming gender diversity. One of the easiest starts for churches is to start telling the sacred stories of strong biblical female figures, especially ones who have been co-opted in some way by white hetero male Christianity. So that would be woman wisdom in Proverbs. That would be referencing the Holy Spirit as female. It would be teaching that Mary Magdalene was not a whore. And it would be looking at Hagar as a woman who is abused by Abraham, impregnated, and then abandoned. And yet her child established a faith tradition. So we need to bring the women's stories out of the Bible and into our sanctuaries. We need to encourage liberal white males to examine the reality of their privilege and to confront any of the traditions and perspectives that are imposed on them that give them permission to ignore, dismiss, or change the subject when the issue of misogyny is raised. And as a church, we need to stop preaching the inferiority and the sinfulness of the body. We need to raise up the necessity of the human body to perform the work of Christ in the world. If you have an opportunity, reread St. Teresa of Avila's prayer poem, Christ Has No Body But Yours. It's an amazing guide to honoring the diversity of the human body. Remember when the Constitution was written, those words, "we the people," did not mean all people. And Bible translations and interpretations and church doctrine have marginalized and oppressed huge segments of humanity. And we need to recognize that, call it out, and change it. I've been using the phrase dominant culture rather than majority this evening. So take a moment and just sit for a second with the realization that if you looked at all people and on one side you put the white, Christian, nationalist, cisgendered, heterosexual males, and on the other side you put all women, all people of color, all members of the lettered community, Which group is the majority?
The latter.
The latter. So why are we in the position of weakness?
You accepted it.
We have the numbers. What we don't have is a sense of community and connection. The response to capitalist spirituality is transforming capitalism. And this frightens people because people feel that the response to capitalism, the alternative to capitalism, is socialism, which is equated with communism, and is looked at as being solely an ideology. But there's a difference between socialism, communism, and the equitable, fair distribution of wealth and resources. If we can recognize that quote unquote socialism has a purely economic, non-ideological aspect to it, and that's recognizing the need for structures for shared mutual responsibility for one another's well-being. We need to consider how the best of capitalism and economic aspects of socialism can be combined. We need to look at the viability of national systems of well-being that allow local business communities and entrepreneurs to thrive and the people to survive and survive with dignity. The early Christians lived communally. They cared for everyone's essential needs, and they explicitly focused care for the socially marginalized. They did not live under a capitalist model. The response to domination of creation is learning to belong with earth and animals. Within the church, explore the teachings of eco-theologians, eco-mystics, and creation-focused saints, such as Francis of Assisi, Hildegard of Bingen, Teilhard de Chardin. A more modern example would be Matthew Fox and his creation spirituality. Start practicing and advocating various shifts. Move from consumerism to simplicity. From viewing the earth as a commodity to seeing it as sacred. From alienation from non-human aspects of creation to seeking a sense of belonging and connection. And shifting from oppression to justice and preservation-based practice. And finally, breaking the spiral of violence. We need to recognize that humans are the only known perpetrators of violence who can choose to act otherwise. So become grassroots educators in nonviolent communication and in peace literacy. Redefine what constitutes violence. So think about situations where a group reacts aggressively to economic or social oppression. In that situation, who instigated the violence? Who actually initiated the violence? And utilize legal, spiritual, psychological, or social mediation to encourage conditions of mutuality, similarities, support, forgiveness, and start at the local level. Look at or support restorative justice programs. Look at, initiate, restore, support diversion or community support programs. Find that fear. Find that fear that led to anger. So it comes down to this. Who we are and where we go from here is deeply contingent on our willingness to fully embody the call in Micah 6:8. Simply do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God.
Amen.
Thank you.
Deep breath, everybody.
That was a lot. A lot to think about. Can you give us a preview of next week? She was prepared.
So next week, we're going to look at the theme called Inspired by Faith, Proselytizing versus Evangelism. So we're going to look at what I call grassroots faith, how we put our faith to work in the world. And this is where we're going to start touching on one of the comments that I often get as a minister. How do we respond when we are in the presence of someone who is weaponizing scripture? And we'll actually look at 4 scripture passages that you can put in your toolbox of responses. So we'll look a little more deeply at the Micah passage, do justice, love kindness, at Matthew's version of the Beatitudes. I stuck with Matthew, made this easy. Matthew's version of the Beatitudes, his version of the Great Commandments, and that beautiful passage, for I was hungry and you fed me. So that is where we will go next week. It'll be a little more dialogue based than it was this week. We don't have as many definitions and expressions and confusion. Slightly more limited topic.
What kept coming back to me throughout your whole presentation was, there's an author and a minister that I know, who wrote a book called The Doctrine of Discovery.
Yes.
And the whole idea that the colonization of this country was based on violence and
Yes.
misogyny and, white male domination, and Christianity was thrown in there, Catholic was thrown in there. And that has really in my mind, overpowered, like, undergirded the whole system of that we live with today, and we often forget it. Mark Charles is the name of the author.
Yeah.
But he does presentations all over. He's got Native American background and also European background. And even the language we use, like in my graduate program, somebody used the word Caucasian to describe somebody in their writing, and they were told, we don't use that word anymore, it's white. When that happened. Like, okay,
Hard to keep up.
how to keep up.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Sonia.
Thank
And,
you, everybody. Thank you for sitting through all that.
Well, please let friends and colleagues and family know that we'll be on again. I can send them links if they want to come on electronically. Or obviously come in person. If you want to take a cookie or something before you leave, please do. We keep on trying to eat them up. And we'll see you next week.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
No, God is with us and she loves us. That's just-
One of my favorite sayings is, if God wanted me to be better behaved, she should have given me easier hair. Cause it just does its own thing.
Karen wrote
Thank
on the
you.
chat, I didn't see it. Thanks for getting us started. Says a lot about what local churches generally have failed to do over the last eons.
Yeah.
Uh,
Nice to meet you.